The sun had just begun to rise over the airport. Inside the terminal, it was calm, quiet, and chilly. Standing near Gate 37 was Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't wear a suit, wasn't surrounded by bodyguards, and carried no expensive belongings. To most people, he seemed like any other African traveler. But this man was no ordinary passenger. He was Ibrahim Traoré, the President of Burkina Faso. He preferred to travel in this low-profile manner. Quiet, simple, without any media attention. No press, no announcements. Just like every other citizen, he believed in staying connected to the people and not distancing himself with status or titles. His return from a diplomatic trip to Europe was no different. After concluding crucial meetings where he discussed gold sovereignty and Africa's development, all he wanted now was to return home. As he made his way toward the Air France flight to Ouagadougou, he smiled and greeted an airport worker in French with a warm, "Bonjour, ça va?" The worker smiled back, unaware of the traveler's true identity. That's exactly how Traoré preferred it. He boarded the flight quietly, nodded politely to the flight crew, and settled into seat 2A in business class next to the window. Nobody paid him any special attention, or so he thought. Just a few rows behind, a conversation had already started. A senior French businessman, the CEO of a major energy firm, was also flying to Burkina Faso. He was used to red carpet treatment, first class, service, private lounges, and luxury amenities. But when he arrived at the gate, he was told that business class was full. The CEO didn't like hearing no. Surrounded by his assistants and airline staff, he stood tapping his polished shoes, impatiently. "I'm a key investor in many African projects," he said, expecting that to change things. In his mind, exceptions should be made for people like him. He demanded an upgrade right away. The staff began whispering, checking tablets and making calls. But the situation was straightforward. Business class was completely booked. Still, the CEO kept pushing. That's when a senior flight attendant was called in. She was tall, white, and dressed in a formal Air France uniform. Her name was Claire. With a composed but distant smile, she stepped on board to handle the situation. Once inside the cabin, she scanned the rows carefully. Her eyes paused on a dark-skinned man in 2A, Ibrahim Traoré. Claire didn't see any sign of importance. No suit, no assistant, no watch, just a black man in a hoodie. She leaned toward another attendant and whispered, "Probably a mistake." Then she walked over to him and said with a polite but firm tone, "Monsieur, may I see your boarding pass?" Traoré looked up, handed it to her without saying a word. She glanced at the pass, then at him again. The seat number was correct, but in her eyes something still seemed off. He didn't look like someone who belonged in business class. Moments later, Claire returned with the same professional smile, but her tone was more direct this time. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we may need to move you to economy class to make space for another passenger. You will be compensated." It was a subtle but clear insult. Traoré raised an eyebrow and asked calmly, "Why me?" "No specific reason, sir," Claire replied, trying to remain composed. "Just a small adjustment for an important guest." "A guest more important than me?" he asked, his voice steady and polite. Claire didn't respond. She smiled again but avoided his question. Around them, some passengers began to take notice. A few looked up from their screens and books. The mood in the cabin had shifted. Though no one spoke, Traoré leaned back slightly and said, "No, I will stay in my seat." Claire looked surprised. She wasn't used to resistance, especially not from someone who looked to her like an ordinary African traveler. She forced another smile, but her tone had turned cold. "Sir, I must insist. This is for operational reasons." Traoré didn't blink. "Then please explain why I'm the one being asked to move, not anyone else." Claire hesitated. She hadn't expected this kind of response. She glanced around, then walked off quickly toward the cockpit. When she returned, she didn't speak to Traoré again. Instead, she began approaching other black passengers in business class, one by one. She asked another African man to move, then another. This time, a younger man, probably in his late 20s, looked puzzled and asked, "Why me?" Claire didn't answer. She simply took his boarding pass, That's when Traoré stood up. "Enough," he said. His voice was calm but carried authority. "You are making decisions based on appearance, not tickets. That is discrimination." Claire looked startled. "Sir, please sit down. There's no need to cause a disturbance." He held her gaze. There was nothing aggressive in his tone, but something about his eyes made her pause. Firm, unshaken, confident. Still, she had no idea who he really was. To her, he was just another passenger causing trouble. She turned and walked away again, muttering under her breath in French, "Always making problems." Outside the cabin, the CEO had finally been allowed to board. Claire greeted him warmly and offered him a glass of champagne. "We're resolving the seating issue, monsieur," she said. Back in seat 2A, Traoré had returned to his position, calm and quiet. He buckled his seatbelt and rested his hands on the armrest. He didn't argue or reveal who he was. He didn't make a call or raise his voice. But what had just happened would not be forgotten. The CEO walked past him with confidence, not acknowledging him at all. Claire made sure he was settled, offering extra comfort and more champagne. The contrast was clear. One passenger was respected without question, the other dismissed without cause. The aircraft taxied and lifted into the air, heading for Burkina Faso, carrying not just travelers but an event that would soon become much more than a misunderstanding in the sky. From the outside, everything appeared normal inside the cabin. The seatbelt signs turned off and passengers began to settle into the long flight, but underneath the surface, a quiet storm was taking shape. Ibrahim Traoré remained composed. He didn't complain. He didn't disclose who he was. He simply observed. He watched the situation unfold with the calmness of someone who understood that time would speak louder than words. Claire, meanwhile, avoided making eye contact with him. Something about his presence made her uncomfortable. Still, she carried on as if nothing had happened. Midway through the flight, she returned to his seat. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked with the same forced cheer. He looked at her briefly. "Just water." She nodded and left. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just a brief interaction, as though the earlier exchange hadn't happened. A few rows ahead, the CEO was being treated like a celebrity. Claire laughed at his jokes, leaned in attentively, and asked about his business ventures in Africa. "Burkina Faso is lucky to have us," he said proudly. "We're bringing development and structure to the place." Claire smiled and nodded, clearly impressed. She had no idea that the very person he was referring to, the leader of the country, was seated only 2 rows behind. Nearby, an African nurse returning home to Bobo Dioulasso quietly observed it all. She turned to her seatmate and whispered, "That's our president. They don't even know who they're disrespecting." The man beside her looked shocked but said nothing. Everyone around could sense that the president preferred to remain unnoticed. As the hours passed, the cabin lights dimmed and most of the passengers fell asleep, but Traoré stayed awake, quietly staring out of the window. He wasn't upset. He was patient. Soon the plane began its slow descent into Ouagadougou. The captain's voice came over the speakers in French and English, announcing the arrival. Lights came back on. Passengers adjusted their seats and gathered their belongings. Claire made another round, clipboard in hand, stopping to exchange smiles with the CEO and once again ignoring Ibrahim Traoré completely. Outside, the view was striking. The morning sun cast a golden light over the red earth. The city was just beginning to stir, but below the aircraft, something unusual was folding. A convoy of black SUVs, military trucks, and official vehicles had formed on the tarmac. A full presidential escort was assembling. Inside the plane, passengers began to murmur, "Are those soldiers? Are we landing in the middle of something serious?" Another answered, "That's military protocol. Maybe someone important is arriving." The CEO smirked. "Must be for me," he said jokingly to Claire. She laughed in agreement and began preparing to escort him off the plane personally, even planning to walk him into the terminal herself. But before the plane even came to a complete stop, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. A tall officer in a black beret boarded the aircraft, his steps loud and deliberate as he walked down the aisle. He stopped at seat 2A and saluted sharply. "Mr. President, welcome home." The entire cabin went silent. You could almost hear the air change. Claire's expression froze. Her eyes flicked between the officer and the man in 2A, the man she had questioned, dismissed and overlooked. Her hands began to tremble. Ibrahim. Traoré stood up slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He carried himself with quiet authority, calm, respectful, composed. The CEO, standing nearby, took a step back in surprise. President, he muttered, visibly shaken. Traoré turned to him and gave a simple nod. No words, no emotion, just acknowledgement. His actions spoke louder than anything he could have said. Another officer entered the cabin and looked directly at Claire and the CEO. "We have orders," he said firmly. "Both of you will come with us now." Claire's voice cracked. "Wait, what? Why me?" "You are being detained for questioning," the officer replied without hesitation. "You have publicly disrespected the head of state on national soil. That is a serious matter." Claire tried to laugh it off. No, this must be some kind of mistake. I was just doing my job." No one responded. Traoré exited the aircraft and was greeted immediately by his security team, ministers, and military officers. Beyond the airport fence, a large crowd had gathered to welcome him. Cameras flashed, cheers echoed, but he didn't wave or boast. He simply walked forward, surrounded by his people. Meanwhile, Claire and the CEO were escorted off the plane in handcuffs. Passengers looked on, stunned. Some whispered. Others recorded the moment silently. Gone were their confident expressions. Now confusion and disbelief filled their faces. They were led into separate black vehicles, surrounded by armed guards. No one spoke to them, not even the officers. The silence said it all. It was the silence of lost privilege, of power corrected. Inside the terminal, President Traoré addressed a small group of reporters. He didn't speak with anger. His words were deliberate, clear, and strong. "In Burkina Faso, we don't judge people by their skin color or their clothes. We don't bow to money or old colonial habits. Here we respect dignity, humanity, and our own people. That is the Africa we are building." The message traveled fast. Videos of the arrest began circulating online. Footage of the salute, the handcuffs, and the CEO's stunned face flooded social media. Hashtags spread. Hashtag respect Africa. Hashtag stand with Burkina. African. Youth across the continent celebrated. They saw it as a rare moment of justice, an example of standing up to arrogance, discrimination, and the legacy of colonialism. Meanwhile, at the Ministry of Justice, Claire and the CEO faced formal charges. They were accused of public insult, racial discrimination toward the head of state, and abuse of authority aboard a foreign carrier on Burkina Faso soil. The French embassy quickly stepped in. Calls were made, apologies issued, but President Traoré's response was firm. "This is not a colony, this is a sovereign country. They will face the law just like anyone else." Air France rushed to manage the situation. Within 24 hours, the airline released a public statement, an apology filled with generic language and corporate tone, but the damage was already done. Across Burkina Faso, citizens were outraged. Calls to boycott the airline gained momentum. Soon, other African nations joined in solidarity. Claire, now detained in a facility outside Ouagadougou, broke down during questioning. Tears rolled down her face as she spoke to investigators. "I didn't know who he was," she cried. "I was just following procedures." The lead investigator remained expressionless. "You didn't need to know who he was," he replied. "You only needed to treat him with basic human respect." The CEO, meanwhile, tried to use his connections to get out of trouble. Calls were made to Paris. Messages sent to contacts in high places. But the court had already delivered its position. No special treatment, no diplomatic shortcuts. The ruling was historic. For once, money and influence didn't win. Traoré never gloated. He didn't give speeches or seek revenge. After returning to the presidential palace, he simply resumed his work, overseeing development projects, meeting with youth organizations, reinforcing national security. His focus stayed on the country's future, but what happened on that flight had become a national symbol. It was discussed in homes, classrooms, media outlets, and government offices. A quiet, dignified man had faced discrimination and responded not with anger, but with truth and accountability. Claire and the CEO remained in custody while their cases moved through the legal system. International observers took notice. News outlets around the world reported on the rare moment when a sitting African president personally experienced prejudice and let the system handle it without interference. Social media remained on fire. Memes, hashtags, and quotes from the president's speech spread rapidly. "We don't bow to money or old habits" became a rallying cry. For many, it wasn't just about a flight. It was about decades of being overlooked, spoken down to, or treated as second class. Even within France, public opinion was divided. Some supported the CEO and demanded his release. Others acknowledged the deeper issue, the entitlement often shown by foreign investors and officials when dealing with African countries. Air France, under mounting pressure, suspended Claire and launched an internal review. They promised training, programs, and new procedures. But for many, it was too little, too late. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's approval ratings rose. Not because he punished anyone, but because he stayed grounded. Because he let the truth speak for itself. The nurse who had whispered, "That's our president," later shared her story on a local news channel. "He reminded us that leadership doesn't come from uniforms or luxury," she said. "It comes from how you carry yourself when no one is watching." The flight had landed hours ago, but its impact continued to travel. A simple boarding pass. A quiet man in seat 2A. A decision that exposed the difference between power and pride.